Fingers. They're super important. You can use them for all sorts of things. I use mine almost every single day, apart from on Sundays when I give them a rest. It's important to look after your fingers and not overwork them. One of the best ways you can do this in photography is by setting up custom buttons on your camera. This way your fingers have less work to do when trying to find those features and functions that you're asking of them to go and get for you. Does that sentence make sense? Probably not, but you get the point. It's all about having less work to do to find what you want. Fortunately, it's pretty simple to set up custom buttons on the Canon EOS R. Here's how I have mine set up. First, you want to go into the menu and head over to the orange tab, the second from the right, and tab number 4 under that. This is where you're going to see the options for setting up the custom buttons and the custom dials. Let's start with the custom dials. I have the top dial set to Aperture, and I have the back dial set to shutter speed, or aperture value and time value in Canon speak. I'm not quite sure why they've gone that way around and just haven't called it shutter speed. Time value seems a bit of a mouthful and a bit confusing, but it's shutter speed. Now I have it set up this way because I used to shoot Nikon, and it feels familiar to me to have them set up that way. Aperture at the front, shutter at the back. For the control ring on the RF lenses, I have mine set to exposure compensation. I use exposure compensation quite often. I find it a really useful way to make small adjustments to the exposure of a scene without having to mess with all the other functions and dials and changing settings that I don't really want to. It's pretty easy just to be able to turn it on the lens of the barrel or the barrel of the lens and get the desired result. Although you do have to remember to put it back to 0 once you've used it, otherwise you end up taking photos and being a bit confused about why everything's underexposed or overexposed to what you saw in the viewfinder. Moving on to the custom buttons. As you can see here, you've got 2 columns, one for photography and one for video. This gives you the option of setting up the camera in a slightly different way for shooting video or photos. Now this could be a good or bad thing depending on your memory. You could end up thinking that the button's going to do one thing when you've got it set to another in that mode, but it is quite a useful feature to have. I'm just going to concentrate on the photography side of things for now in order not to make this video an absolute epic, but I think you can understand that the same principles apply to the video side of things, and it's a very similar way of setting stuff up. First thing on the list here you can see is the shutter button. Now I'm quite happy to keep this as it is. I obviously don't want to have to take photos by using the delete button or something weird like this, so I keep it as it is. It's also set up for a half press to focus in and out. I'm also happy with this. A lot of people swear by doing back button autofocus, but I've always found it a bit clumsy, particularly on this camera as it's a little bit small for my hands and I've got a kind of awkward pinch to be able to do that. So I'm quite happy with it being a half press on the shutter button. I use the multi-function dial as my dedicated ISO button. Tap it once and then the front dial becomes the ISO selector. I can move the ISO up or down or put it on auto or whatever. I have it this way because I don't actually like changing the ISO all that often. I'd sooner change the aperture or the shutter speed, so one extra click there isn't too bad because I'm not doing it that often. With the multifunction button, if you press it and turn the back dial, it actually changes what it's changing. So you can turn it on to different options like shutter speed or whatever. So what I do is I just have it kept set as ISO, and then that way, press it once, turn the dial, I don't confuse myself. Next one is the movie record button. Again, I'm quite happy to leave this how it is. I actually don't really like the button being on the top of the camera, and this one's a bit squidgy and doesn't always react the way you hope it would when you press it. You can find sometimes that you've half pressed it and it hasn't started recording, or you've fully pressed it when you just touched it slightly. I much prefer the way it used to be implemented on the DSLRs where you had that button on the back. It seemed more natural to me. Obviously at the moment, or obviously on the Canon EOS R, that back area now is taken up with the touch bar thing, so it's useful to have it. They had to put it somewhere, I guess that's okay. It's also actually quite a good feature on it where you can actually just press that button and you start recording in your video settings that you've got set to the custom setup preset 1. So you don't have to switch the little switch and go in and out of video mode. It just starts recording straight away. So if you see something you want to video, hit that button and away you go. The LCD button that lights up the little LCD on the top and toggles through that, I leave that alone. It seems like it's designed perfectly for doing that, and it's not a very prominent button, so you might fiddle around trying to find that if you were shooting. And again, with the mode button, I don't want to change that. I think that's perfectly fine. It'll just make things complicated if you want to change that somewhere else. Right, now onto some buttons that I have actually changed from the default. So the AF on button on the back of the camera, I've actually got this changed to selecting different autofocus options. And in the camera, I've limited the options available to me to just two. I've got the single point autofocus option and the face tracking option. They're the two options that I use the most often. I actually use single point probably 90% of the time with things that I do, but I just want to have the ability to, if I need to take a snap of someone or take somebody's picture, I can quickly switch to that. I don't have to fumble through lots of different things, so it's just one press and over it goes. Seems to work perfectly fine for me. You may want to have the other options in there and then it's more presses to cycle through it, but the way I've got it set up, one press changes it and one press changes it back. Next to that button is the little star button thing. I don't know what this is called, but I assume it's got another name. I have it set to turning on the eye tracking focus. Now, I don't actually use this a lot, and I'd sooner have this button assigned to something else, but I'll go into that a bit later. The button under this is the autofocus point selector. You press this once and then you can use the direction pad or the up, down, left, right button to move the autofocus point around the screen. Now, in video mode, this is actually a magnification button. It allows you to zoom in on the image and check that you've got critical focus. And that's how I've got it set up in the stills mode. Effectively, this whole top corner of the camera is set to my focus options. Moving down, the next button is the info option button, and you can't map anything to this, so it doesn't matter what you want to put there, you simply can't. So the next set of buttons that you can customize are the actual D-pad buttons, or the up, down, left, right buttons, or whatever you want to call them. As I said before, you normally have to use to press the selector button and then you had access to moving them around, but I've got mine defaulted to just move that AF point as soon as I press them. I think this is a lot easier and less clumsy than having to actually press a button before you have access to being able to do that. Now, normally I just use the back of the screen. I either press where I actually want focus to be, or you can use your thumb on the top corner and drag the AF point around. But sometimes that doesn't always work, particularly if you're wearing gloves, if it's a cold day. So it's handy to be able to just have access to that and be able to move it around. It is a little bit slow and unresponsive. It's not as good as having a joystick there, but hey, we know Canon took the decision not to include a joystick on this camera. It's coming in the future cameras. They must have had a change of heart and realised, actually, it's better doing it with a joystick. Annoyingly, on this camera, the only way to change the metering mode on the camera is to actually go into the Q menu and select it there. So I've had to leave the button in the middle of the D-pad set as the Q menu button. So I tap this once and then I go in and then I leave it actually selected over the option of changing the metering modes, and I only have to jog left and right to be able to select the one I want. Now there's 4 options in there. I only ever use 2 of them. I use the evaluative one where it gives you an overall exposure for the whole scene. Normally if you're taking landscape images or, well, any sort of images really, 90% of the time this is going to be spot on. But I do sometimes use the spot metering mode where it just takes the autofocus spot that's being selected and meters everything off that reading there. It's a bit of a shame of that. I wish they could put that on one of the other buttons. Ideally, the little star button on the top right hand corner, which I have set to the eye autofocus at the moment. I would love it to be able to be up there where I can just press it once and toggle through the different options that are available. It would be even better if I could limit the amount of modes it toggles through, just like the AF option. I don't know if it's possible for Canon to be able to change this in a firmware update. I'm sure it is. They're a big company, they've got the resources, they know how to do this sort of stuff. So yeah, hopefully they'll do that, but I'm not going to hold my breath on it. Maybe the future cameras will have that option in there, and I'd really enjoy it if they did. The play and delete buttons on the bottom of the camera, you can't change them, they're stuck as they are, but it is useful to note that the delete button can be used to recenter the AF point. It took me a bit of a while to figure this out. I was tapping on the camera, always having to drag it back to the middle, and it was a bit hard actually centering it. You'd always be a little bit off, but tap that delete button and it shoots back to the center. It's quite useful. So there's only one other thing that I occasionally change on this camera, and that's the frame rate in the stills mode, turning it from taking one shot to multiple shots as you hold down the shutter button. You know what I'm talking about. So you can't set this to a default button, which again is a little bit annoying. I'd love to have it there where I can just tap and cycle through those two options. The only way to change this is to use the multi-function button on the top. If you press this and scroll the back wheel, you'll change through the options that the multi-function wheel gives you. So you can change from ISO over to the frame rates or one of the other options in there, shutter speed and things like that. So you have to use this. I'm not a fan of it, but it's not too complicated. You just have to remember that you're pressing that multi-function button and then turning the back dial, and then to set it back to how it was originally, so that I can use that front wheel as the ISO button, or the ISO dial, sorry. Yeah, a little bit of a pain again, but hey, what can you do? We have to live with it, don't we? In my opinion, Canon have done a semi-reasonable job in giving you the options to customize this camera. I'd definitely like there to be a few more options in there, as I've discussed, but on the whole, it's an improvement on how cameras used to be. Maybe they can improve things with a firmware update. I don't know. Be nice if they did though, wouldn't it? Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I don't want you to do anything. Just enjoy it. See ya.